Hello, it's Joseph, and welcome back to my series called Colonizing Kerbin. This is the 11th episode in this series, and if you are just now joining this series, you've missed out on 10 episodes. And in those first 10 episodes, I focused on unlocking the tech tree in a science mode playthrough of Kerbal Space Program. So feel free to go back and check out those previous 10 episodes, which I made basically combined into a playlist for anyone that wants to go back. So since in the last episode I fully unlocked the tech tree, I now have access to all of the tech available to me in stock Kerbal Space Program. The game is essentially now a sandbox game mode, but I decided to begin the process now of colonizing the Minmus. Eventually we're going to go to Duna and Laythe in orbit of Jool. So you saw me recruiting some new members to our program because in this episode, we are going to be building a science station in low Kerbal orbit, which I'm going to call LKO for the rest of the episode. And this science station essentially is going to be a sort of analogy of the real-life International Space Station. So I kind of wanted to go for a semi-realistic approach to where a space program would progress in the conquest of their own solar system. And of course, that's where we are in the real world. Space stations in low Earth orbit, and researching how that affects how low gravity or no gravity affects the human body. So essentially the Kerbals are going to be doing the same thing, doing research on what are the long-term effects of space travel on the Kerbal body, and, essentially just how does low gravity affect everything in life. So, you saw, basically I'm going to take a moment now before I continue talking about the space station. I want to talk about the reusable system that I am using to get my payloads into orbit. And if you've seen my previous episodes, you've seen some of this being used. You've already seen one or two of my booster types being used. So I essentially have a system for my main boosters. So that's the orange section right now that you're seeing getting the payload into orbit. I call this particular booster the HOPL 1.0. And HOPL essentially just stands for Heavy Orbital Payload Launcher, and its job is to get the payloads into a suborbital trajectory. And you can see there's a little probe that just disappeared. It was that white curved line that disappeared. That was what happens if I do not take control of that booster, retake control of that booster quick enough. So its job is to get high enough out of the atmosphere that I have enough time to circularize the payload. Then I can retake control of that booster and safely get it to land. And if you go back earlier in this episode, you'll see that the first booster was landed successfully. The next part of my system, the upper stage that got the payload circularized, is what I call the OPTM, and I only have two of those. The OPTM stands for Orbital Payload Transfer Module. So its job is to transfer the payloads into an orbit. Sometimes if the payload's small enough, I can transfer them over to the MUN or to Minmus. And just like with the main booster, there's air brakes to help it slow down and parachutes. But that doesn't slow it down enough to avoid damage, so I have to do a little puff of the engine right before it lands. So now that you have an idea how my reusable deployment system works, let's talk about the space station finally, which we've launched 2 modules of that space station already, and now we're on the 3rd. So the first module that was launched a while ago is essentially just a science lab part that is underneath the science category. It is called the Mobile Processing Lab. It's essentially just, the core part's essentially just that processing lab. And by the way, that's why I have to puff. Yeah, thanks, Picard. That's why I have to puff the engines at just the right time, especially when I'm landing in the water. And I don't seem to have that much problem with landing my boosters, the other boosters that I have. This This HOPL one is the one I seem to have the most trouble with, which I'll get into in a second. Let's get back to talking about the station. So the second module has a large set of radiators to help radiate heat away from the station, because when it's, in direct sunlight, you're going to get heat. And it also has a bunch of the solar panels. So it's basically the main input of power into the system, into the station. The third module that you just saw me dock is that module contains a couple of I forget what they're called. That's right, the Mark I crew cabins. So basically it's got some living space in the center. And then on the outside, it has the science experiments, and it has a bunch of batteries and RTGs to provide additional power to the station. And then this final module that you see here, you're going to see the fairing deploy in just a second, and there it is. So you can see there's a couple of Mark I crew cabins, but those aren't really for living spaces. Those are going to be the docking ports for when my spacecraft are docking with the station. And it's got a cupola facing one direction and another one facing the opposite direction. So one of those is going to face towards Kerbin, so Kerbals can take selfies of Kerbin in the background, and the other one will face towards the stars. So here is another successful landing of the HOPL-1, and here comes another puff of the engine, and voila. Not too bad. And now I'm docking the final module to the station. So the next part, of course, will be to get a crew up to the station. I'm going to put 2 crew members up on the station. Here's a kind of just a beauty shot with Mun in the background, the sun in the background. So while this OPTM is safely deorbiting itself, I want to briefly mention that this space station I placed into an inclined orbit, so it is not in an equatorial orbit, and this also was in spirit of the International Space Station as well. I decided to match its orbit to Minmus, which is at a 6-degree inclination in relation to Kerbin. Now, I have seen some KSP YouTubers, they'll build a space station in a similar manner. It'll be in the same inclination to Minmus, and they'll essentially use it as a gateway station for transferring crew from low Kerbin orbit to Minmus. That wasn't my original intention, but now that I'm thinking of that out loud, I guess I could totally do that in the future. So the crew that are coming up are new members of our crew. You can read their names in the bottom right. And the craft that you're going to see in a second, I call the LKO transport. And its booster on this portion of the mission did not survive. I will talk to you about why that is in just a second. But as you can see, this craft kind of has a little bit of the profile characteristics of the Crew Dragon of SpaceX. I was pretty happy with this mission. A lot of my designs are very much, inspired by other YouTubers like Marcus House or Matt Lown and things like that. But I felt this mission was one of those ones that, these designs were a little more, me, a little bit of my originality or my creativity. Though it's hard to be 100% original in this game, considering there's a limited number of parts in stock. So as you can see, the solar panels are attached to some robotic arms. We have these large radiators, and we have some communication dishes. In a second, you're going to see some relays that I have on some rotors. And I kind of envisioned those. I've seen those on the International Space Station, so I kind of envisioned those as like, radar dishes that can help, the LKO transports guide themselves to the station. And we're going to have a couple Kerbals go out and inspect the station for you to show you how it functions, and there's all the science experiments. And then our newest engineer is going to go on EVA and fly around the station. So real quickly, back to why that booster didn't survive. Basically, this booster, the HOPL-1, works pretty well for my lower mass payloads. And each of these modules, since the latest update includes, mass from the Kerbals and whatever they're carrying, I think that, the LKO transport kind of pushes the limit of that HOPL-1, and I can land it safely. However, I didn't launch it into orbit high enough for it to basically land safely. In other words, long story short, I do the same mistake here in just a second. As you can see, it's a bit of a more shallow launch angle. So that means that by the time I take control of this booster, it's already burning up in the atmosphere, and I basically have missing my opportunity to slow it down quick enough. And as you can see on that one, this parachute's deployed way too late. So what I've decided is to use my HOPL-2, which is basically a Saturn V booster design in the game for future uses of the LKO. So as this final crew makes its way towards the station, this will basically be the last part of the episode, and we'll get some beauty shots here. You notice that the new navigation lights are on the station. That came out in the most recent updates, and that helped me kind of line things up and make it kind of pretty. So anyways, that pretty much wraps up the episode, as we have this beautiful shot of Kerbin and the space station in orbit. Thank you so much for watching, and you all have a wonderful day.